the fact that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has now been in existence officially for over 10 years and has had 3 successful phases of films, plenty has been put forth as official chronological fact. But times change, things, situations, circumstances, and characters need to be updated, removed, or edited in terms of chronology, fact, and law within the shared film universe. These are just some facts that have changed about the Marvel Cinematic Universe from after Avengers Endgame. Time travel can often be viewed in films and screenplay writing as a method or procedure to explain away facts, or in modern films, even carelessly ignore changes or details within plot, or forget circumstances that have already been established prior to the point of the said time traveling. Aspects can be presented by time travel can be hard to explain or address as well, usually with end results being somewhat paradoxes or difficult to understand in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, such as these. How can there be 2 versions of Mjolnir? How could Captain America fight against his past self? Can events be changed if they are known to others, or are they best kept secret to prevent timeline fluctuations? Such as the Ancient One and Bruce Banner speaking about the time gem, Thor and his mother's conversation, the marriage of Steve Rogers and Peggy Carter. These are said events that technically exist outside the main timeline because they were done after the said moment in time relating to the situation. These events would have arguably not have occurred if it were not for one of the said people involved in a situation knowing future events and relating them to a past person whom did not or would not know of the event that they would be placed in, thus changing the future of the general timeline, either for themselves or others, whichever it might be. The condition for these circumstances existing outside the main timeline or outside general knowledge, these situations or conditions cannot be spoken about to persons other than the original people whom had known or participated in the particular event. If these said events or situations were to be publicly known or even spoken about, perhaps there would be dire consequences for the main timeline theoretically, mostly for change or future altering by possible time travelers yet to come, or others wishing to alter scenarios or situations even more than already done. The best example of this is when Steve did not mention whom he was married to by Sam Wilson at the end of Endgame. Even though Sam had noticed the wedding ring on his finger, Steve did not mention whom he was married to. Another fact was not necessarily mentioned or rather explained in detail in Avengers Endgame or even Infinity War were details about how exactly Thanos knew Iron Man, even referring to him by name. When Thanos used the Infinity Gauntlet, he could have possibly used all of the powers in existence to learn about who Tony Stark was and mention this to him in a teasingly vague method of speech. Various explanations have been discussed, and some have been proposed that since Iron Man used the gauntlet and that the actual snap is what caused the death of Thanos and his minions, along with his army, is that Tony was responsible for the death of Thanos, and in some bizarre way as a result of this, Thanos knew who his killer was, hence Tony. What's more interesting is that with the Avengers time traveling using the quantum realm, Thanos did not have long technically to use the gauntlet or the gems. The idea of Thanos knowing who Iron Man was now does not exactly seem likely, as it's now theorized even further and confirmed that when Thanos searched for the gems, over a period of almost a decade, he learned a great deal of things during this so-called Infinity Quest. Perhaps Tony Stark was one of those many facts and details of which he had learned during the said quest to search for the gems. But as a result of the Avengers changing the timeline, this all changed, and Thanos not fully obtaining the Infinity Gems and learning how to use the gems through those methods, it might never necessarily be fully or adequately explained or mentioned as to how Thanos came to know of Tony Stark exactly. Throughout Infinity War and Endgame, the characters that have lived and died have been many, but there have been controversy about the exact circumstances of certain characters' deaths, depending on who had died or even retired in some of the situations. Before Endgame was released, commentators did mention the possibility of Tony Stark dying somehow, some way in the film, but these polls or predictions were not entirely reliable. People argued that Tony Stark would not or could not die because of how important or reliant the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Marvel Studios have become with attachment to the character of Iron Man, and Robert Downey Jr. for his crucial success with the character as well. Chris Evans often had public comments of him being tired from playing Steve Rogers. Despite his joy for the role and everything he received from it, he was clearly tired of it. All of this, and these were very public claims that he was making even before Infinity War was ever filmed. Not all film critics or analysts enjoy the portrayal of Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man. And in all fairness, there might have been, in some cases were, more approval and praise for Evans' performances as Captain America before the Infinity War and Endgame films were released. Despite the fact that Black Widow was written very well in terms of a character for the Avengers and related films, Marvel Studios always had problems fitting the character into her own film, despite confirmed theories and speculation that a solo Black Widow film had been up for discussion and speculation among film executives since at least the original Avengers film being released in 2012. Though there were positive claims from Scarlett Johansson about a solo film being made, nothing ever came of it, or at least in the particular way that the Marvel Studios were originally envisioning it. The logical aspects of it being that Black Widow isn't necessarily strong enough of a character to have a solo story. Villains and theme were the main reasons of a film not being made at the time. Literally. Screenwriters that Marvel Studio pitched the idea to possibly come up with a script for a solo Black Widow film at the time mentioned that due to the somewhat vague aspects of Natasha Romanoff's history in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it's not exactly feasible to do a film about the character to be done correctly. She has no powers or special abilities, just training as a Russian spy and SHIELD operative. How would a film about her be done besides what can be normally seen from the character in any sort of Marvel film that she was already portrayed in? Some have said that the reason why the character was killed off in that shocking way that she was seen in Endgame had to do with the fact that the script-wise, the character had reached a dead end in terms of development and progression. So, the decision was to have made the character die in a spectacular method while she was still fresh and vibrant with movie audiences as well as comic book readers. However, the idea of a solo film at the time was not exactly forgotten, and Marvel Studios put forth the idea of a prequel for the film as to be before the character reached a chronological dead end in terms of character growth and development. Many film commentators as well as analysts of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in general consider when looking back at the first three phases, always have said that the Hulk was nothing but sadly wasted potential in terms of what we, the viewers of the films, could have seen from the character and what we actually could have envisioned. The main reason is that the film rights for the character were not necessarily under full Marvel Studios control. Any rights of the Incredible Hulk in terms of films would be complex and hard to fully manage. This is why the Hulk was always in a supporting role, never ever in the main focus of a film or even story. Film rights and revenue for the character would always be divided up whenever the character made appearance in a film or even mentioned. As per Marvel Cinematic Universe lore, using the Infinity Gauntlet meant that the arm that housed the gauntlet in which the gems were used is unusable anymore, and as a major character, the Hulk can't be theoretically used. So essentially the character is retired like Captain America, though technically could be as an advisor most certainly, but as a fighter or true force, this is no longer the situation. Especially with Marvel Studios branding the revamped Miss Marvel as Captain Marvel for the film universe. This is even more of an unofficial retirement for the character. Also, commentators have said that the actor at which portrays the Hulk, Mark Ruffalo, has somewhat been hard to control by Marvel Studios. Gamora is a very interesting example in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in which terms of a character, the plot and development of her as a character were completely erased. From all of the events as a character from the Guardians of the Galaxy Volumes 1 and 2 to the Infinity War and Endgame, all of this progression is now completely gone, as well as her relationship with Peter Quill. As per Endgame, the Gamora that started off the Phase 3 was a reset from even before technically chronologically Guardians of the Galaxy. Story-wise, Gamora is still loyal to Thanos at the time, and this mindset is still very prominent, and it was actually Nebula whom was the voice of reason with the pair, and Nebula was actually the good sister and Gamora the bad in Endgame. Some have theorized that if Gamora was not so important to the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise as well as her relationship with Star-Lord, that her death would have been chronologically permanent like Black Widow's death. But due to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the film needed the character and thus her revival in Endgame. The exact opposite of Gamora, Nebula had plenty of character progression from the Guardians of the Galaxy films as well as Infinity War along with Endgame, so much so that when Nebula was forced to kill her past self, no one bothered to notice necessarily or hesitated about this decision. Earning the trust and respect of Tony Stark is definitely something worth mentioning, and despite the fact that Nebula is both dead and alive at the same time means that script-wise, this could be important for future phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we all later witnessed. It's actually rather important to remember what Bruce Banner once said about the Vision, that his mind was an imprint of his own along with that of Tony Stark's brain patterns and Ultron's artificial intelligence. All of these, including the Mind Gem, created what we knew, whom we had known as the Vision. Theoretically, the Vision could be and was remade according to the information that Shuri copied while Vision was with the Avengers in Wakanda. So much like the other characters whom were altered by what had happened with Thanos' snap. The character can't or would exist post-Phase 3 or post-snap, but never in the way before the snap occurred. Due in part to the lack of the use with the Incredible Hulk in films due to the rights of the character and Thor being used extensively to help make up for this loss, Marvel Studios portrayed Miss Marvel as Captain Marvel and promoted her as the strongest character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When the film was released, there was plenty of news online about the so-called most powerful being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe being a woman. As there were plenty of examples of controversy, as analysts mentioned, this was a completely different type of heroine, and not all people were impressed with this concept. This is true. But as James Rhodes said during Endgame, well, where the hell were you when everything happened? Which is exactly a good point. Chronologically, the film of Captain Marvel takes place in the mid to late 1990s, well before everything happened in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, starting with Tony Stark's abduction in the Middle East in 2008. So the most powerful hero in the universe suddenly appears almost 20 years later at the end of the greatest fight in Avengers history, and people are just to assume that her powers and abilities are to make sure that they prevail in the final fight against Thanos. The controversy goes even further with fan theories and speculations at the time shortly after the release of the Captain Marvel film that supposedly Marvel Studios had 2 film cuts made of Endgame, or script scenarios set. The first scenario being this, that if Captain Marvel was a failure in terms of ticket sales or viewer reception were negative to the film as well as the plots and elements, stories and concepts in it, that Captain Marvel would not have that much of a role or exposure in Endgame due to the negative feedback from fans as well as critics and analysts. The second scenario was that if Captain Marvel was a success in terms of ticket sales or viewer reception, in terms of concepts, themes, and plot of the film, that Captain Marvel would have a much larger role in the film and exposure due to the positive anticipation and reaction from movie viewers as well as comic book readers. An interesting fact brought out in the film is that there were 2 hammers from Thor. One was Mjolnir and the other Stormbreaker, but it also brought back the idea that Captain America was indeed worthy of holding Thor's hammer. In Age of Ultron, Steve was unable to wield Mjolnir, but for some reason was able to during Endgame. If we only consider the films as source material when Odin bewitched Thor's hammer, it was quote-unquote, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." Apparently, if we view the hex on the hammer, there is no saying that a person whom lifted the hammer but failed could later lift it again and find themselves worthy, as this is now the case chronologically officially with Steve Rogers. Those that argue that Mjolnir couldn't have been technically used is the fact that the hammer was destroyed by Hela in Ragnarok, but at the same time, the hammer could have been used by Thor by taking Mjolnir to the future, using it for when it was needed, then returning it to the exact moment that he had removed it from the past moment in the timeline. But since time travel could only be done a few times, it seems impossible that the hammer could have been returned to its rightful place. If we still further consider the original bewitching of the hammer, it says that Steve Rogers somehow became worthy in the events that occurred after the Age of Ultron, but before or during Endgame. As to what exactly could have been the catalyst for him being able to wield the hammer, it could be anyone's guess. Endgame ended with the original Avengers or characters affiliated with the Marvel Cinematic Universe being the focus in Infinity War and mostly Endgame. Marvel Studios executives did want to end the third phase with the original characters and essentially end the Avengers, with what came next being completely new. Another reason being that more than a few of the actors and actresses associated with the films and plots connected to it were actually growing tired of their roles, as well as the mental and physical exhaustion that came with the responsibility. Shortly after Endgame was released in theaters, movie viewers and comic book readers actually noticed details in the film that were not exactly explained nor they fully addressed at the time. The idea or concept of accidental or possibly intentional alternate timelines caused by the time heist. Theories have been presented online as well as ideas that alternate Earths were created as a result of Thanos' snap or the Avengers changing the past through minute details to obtain the gems for the gauntlet to reverse what Thanos had done. More or less, all the ideas focused around 4 or 5 alternate timelines. Keep in mind that the main or original timeline is the only one revisited by the Avengers. When the Avengers went back in time to retrieve the gems before Thanos and his minions obtained them, they unknowingly or purposefully changed that past of that particular timeline for that particular gem. As a result, the future of that timeline might have been different due to make up for the gem not being there in that said timeline. The first alternate timeline diverged in 1970, where Steve and Tony traveled to S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters. 4 of Dr. Henry Pym's experimental vials were stolen by the duo, and Tony gives parental advice to his own father. Howard notices that something is odd but can't seem to figure out what that is exactly. Details have been discussed that in the first Ant-Man film, there was a rift between Hank Pym and S.H.I.E.L.D. officials in 1989 due to his shrinking technology being used in ways that he didn't want. This was a huge reason for him leaving S.H.I.E.L.D., if not the main reason, when he did, and this later influenced him using the technology as well as his relationship with his wife and daughter. With the theft of his technology in 1970, perhaps his attitudes towards others with relation to his technology research might become even more extreme. In all of the Iron Man and Captain America films, Howard Stark is remembered and viewed as someone who prefers to spend his time with his inventions in business. Theories have been put forth that due to the advice from Tony, Howard might become more of a family man and be a good father and husband, but without Howard Stark's visionary attitude, the United States of America might not have had the technological edge that it had over the Soviet Union during the Cold War, as was mentioned during the Iron Man films. The second alternate timeline diverged in 2012 right after the Chitauri invasion. This timeline is particularly difficult to explain because this divergence had the most changes. Loki actually escapes with the Terra sect rather than be escorted back to Asgard with Thor. The Hydra elements in S.H.I.E.L.D. actually think that Captain America is on their side. During the battle when Cap fights his past self, he mentions that Bucky is still alive in the conversation between the Ancient One and Bruce Banner. While it's difficult to know how the Marvel Cinematic Universe timeline would progress under these different circumstances, it's interesting to know that during the conversation between the Ancient One and Bruce Banner, she actually mentions that she already knows who Stephen Strange is, as well as her own death. This confirms the conversation that she had with Stephen right before her own death in the first Doctor Strange film, and as a result, this might be the only divergence that's technically within the main timeline, though not exactly primary knowledge. The third alternate timeline diverged in 2013, with Thor and Rocket sneaking into Asgard shortly before Malekith's attack. Rocket takes the reality gem from Jane Foster, and Thor has a quote-unquote final conversation with his mother, as she herself knows that this is the future version of Thor, not the Thor from her own timeline. After they speak, he actually takes the Mjolnir from this timeline and returns with Rocket to the main timeline. Theories here come from the fact that if Thor in this timeline doesn't have his hammer, then he's at a serious disadvantage for every fight that he's in from that moment on during and after Malekith's attack on Asgard. The fourth alternate timeline diverged in 2014 when War Machine and Nebula head to Morag to ambush Star-Lord before he discovers the power gem. Attacking him and obtaining the gem, this timeline received a fair bit of internet attention due to theories that, realistically, without Gamora's love and the Guardians to help him, he would have eventually been discovered by Ego the Living Planet, and chances are he would have died instead of successfully fighting him off. The theory goes even further that this cosmic force would have eventually found its way to Earth, where the Avengers would have most likely killed him or stopped him in some way, or Captain Marvel would have done the same thing as well. There is also a fifth possible alternate timeline that diverged, perhaps in 1945, when Captain America travels back to the quantum realm to hide the Infinity Gems. Deciding to use the time gem, he travels back even further than anyone else prior to this, right after his disappearance after the end of the first Avenger, and decides to live the remainder of his life with Peggy. This is technically not an alternate timeline, because if Steve went back to be with the woman that he loved, then he wouldn't grow old in an alternate timeline, not be able to return to the exact one that he had left. The idea is that when he had gone back, he had to live in absolute secrecy for decades. Though possible, it would have been astronomically hard to do successfully. Steve Rogers' appearance as Captain America would have been public knowledge. This is right after the end of the Second World War, and many would have wanted to keep his memory alive after his sudden disappearance. This memory being kept alive by the American public would have been enforced even more by the Howling Commandos and Howard Stark. But interestingly, S.H.I.E.L.D. had records on whom Peggy was married to, but they never specifically mentioned the husband's name or had pictures of this person. So it might have been possible for Steve to live a quiet life with Peggy in some method or way.